This video is sponsored by Factor. Go to the link in the description or go to factor75.com and enter the code PaleoAnalysis50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. We have traveled from the birth of our planet over 4.5 billion years ago to the cooling and solidification of our crust and the formation of the moon. We had seen our world change as the eons ticked by, eventually forming multicellular life, and an explosion of what followed. This led to an arms race between different types of animals for dominance. Different types of ecosystems and species came and went, but every time, new, more advanced organisms rose to replace the fallen. We just kept bouncing back. That is, until we very nearly didn't. 252 million years ago, only about 5% of the species that existed 1 million years before were still alive. And it was in this sorry state that the Mesozoic era began. And, unfortunately, for the handful of survivors that were left, they were not out of the woods just yet. The rate of extinctions did slow, but in this case, the planet itself was going to make recovery much more challenging than any time before. It will take a daunting 30 million years just for life to reach a level of diversity anything close to what it had been like before in the Permian. And that's what we're going to cover today, in the first half of the Triassic period. Ever since the Carboniferous period, we had seen the continents slowly coming together, and that was actually some of the factors that led to the doomsday scenario that we had just endured. The volcanic activity that was caused by these massive tectonic plates smashing into each other. But now, at long last, for the time being at least, the continents had gone dormant. For the first time since the earliest barren land masses were first forming in the ocean, there was only one enormous landmass, Pangea. Now, I have seen many a meme on the internet that has implied that if the continents were all still joined together like how they were in the Triassic, the world would be in some way a better place, for some reason. And I gotta say, as somebody who has a pretty good understanding of what the world was like during this time, I don't understand this romanticized view of the supercontinent. Because this geologic condition did not do any favors for the things left living on the surface of the planet. Life on early Triassic Pangea was hard. One of the main reasons was because with a landmass this big, it was basically impossible for rainwater to make its way to the interior. This was a process that had already started previously in the Permian when the continents were finally coming together. But when you add all the greenhouse gases that had been pumped into the atmosphere for the past million years, the end result was the biggest, hottest desert that has ever existed on our planet. Temperatures soared to a staggering 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, the lowest setting on your oven is what the majority of the land felt like.
It's so hot. I'm so hungry.
Yeah, unfortunately, the way the interior was didn't leave much food available. Lystrosaurus was one of the only Permian animals that could really make a living. Basically the same way that they had survived the Permian extinction, by burrowing underground and living on a diet of tough roots and tubers.
If only I had access to some type of high nutrition, easy to prepare meals.
Tim, is this a segue to a sponsorship?
No. Maybe. We can't all be like Lystrosaurus living on roots and tubers. And if you're struggling to meet your nutrition goals, Factor makes it easy by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. We've talked about HelloFresh before on the channel, and we really love their products. But the meals that they send to you are basically ingredients and a recipe, which is great if you love to cook. But Factor is basically all the nutrition of HelloFresh, but made even easier with ready-to-eat meals. So for my furry little lazy butt, that's perfect. They arrive pre-prepared and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And if you head to factor75.com or click on the link in the description below and use the promo code PaleoAnalysis50, you'll get 50% off your first Factor box. That's right, that's half off. And if you like it, you can get set up with meal plans that can range from 4 to 18 meals per week. And you can add or reduce the number depending on your specific needs. Plus, it's easy to skip a week if you ever need to. These meals are delivered fresh, never frozen, to your door. Just heat, eat, and enjoy. You can cook them in the microwave or the oven. But this isn't just a standard microwave meal. Factor offers keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan plus veggie options. All seafood, meat, and plant-based meals. So again, head to factor75.com or click on the link in the description below and use the code PaleoAnalysis50 to get 50% off your first Factor box.
The only reprieve was along the coasts, where just enough rain could develop to support a decent amount of vegetation, as well as within the oceans itself. And that fact may have led to several different groups of reptiles returning to a life in the sea for the first time since their ancestors crawled out onto land 100 million years before. With so much of the land becoming a sun-baked desert, many different animals were being forced to convert to a very different way of life. Only so many could inhabit the coastal forests, and the niches there came with a ton of competition. Now, the oceans were actually affected even more than the land by the Great Dying, but there were a few groups that did manage to pull through, like the bony and lobe-finned fish, sharks, and ammonites. And because conditions were not remaining as downright terrible as they were across most of Pangea, these groups were able to spread and become the basis for the new marine food web. And a well-established food web would be all it took for many different groups of reptiles to return to their ancestral home in the ocean. And as a result of this, things started to get pretty weird. Especially the freaks of evolution that took advantage of the explosion in population of shellfish and bivalves along the shallow coasts. One of the most bizarre examples is our old friend, Adipodentatus, who we have an entire episode dedicated to. But Jar Jar here would not be alone, joined by the armored placodonts like this Placotus, whose teeth were super specialized to be a shell-grinding machine, as well as another creature that we've mentioned before, the long-necked Tanystropheus, who used its long neck to be able to catch shallow water fish. As ungainly of a design as this is, it's actually quite genius. It allows the animal to put its head, the part that needs to be close to the fish in order for it to eat, close to its target without needing to get the whole body closer to the fish, which is more likely to scare it away. So if you're not going to invest your evolution points into being faster and more maneuverable, this is probably the next best way to go in the water. But as we go further out into the more open ocean, we see the groups that took the opposite strategy to fishing. First up, we have the Nothosaurs, a group of superficially lizard-looking reptiles with interlocking teeth in their mouths, which again was an excellent strategy to catching slippery fish. And in the future, this combination of adaptations, as well as speed, would come together to make the descendants of Nothosaurs like Nothosaurus, Lariasaurus, and Kichausaurus one of the most successful groups of marine reptiles of all time. Lariasaurus being particularly interesting because it's the first reptile that we have evidence for giving birth to live young. This is a trait that allowed them to spread into the open ocean instead of having to remain on the coast where they could still come onto land to lay eggs. But there was one more group in the oceans of the Triassic, and they would be the ones to quickly grab dominance in the open sea. They started out small, like many do, with animals like Gripaia and Utasasaurus, and they quickly came to dominate the Pathalassic Ocean. What gave them the edge was that they were by far the fastest marine animals around. These were the first ichthyosaurs, a group of streamlined marine reptiles who took hydrodynamics to such an extreme that many people often compare them to dolphins and modern fish today. But these were reptiles. This was a group that made the post-apocalyptic world their own. And by the end of this period, they were going to make it big. Very, very big. But there was one other group of reptiles that would seize this broken world for themselves. And in order to see them, we have to once again return to the land, where the real arms race was about to begin. During the Permian, two major clades of vertebrates were on an equal playing field against one another. In some environments and situations, being ectothermic like the diapsids was beneficial because it allowed you to go longer without food as long as you could get supplemental energy from the sun. But this made you more reliant on warm climates to maintain a livable body temperature. And on the other side, being endothermic, like many of the synapsids, allowed you to live in just about any environment or climate as long as you could find food. This is generally seen as more sustainable, but the truth is it's also very expensive.
Daddy Bender, we're hungry.
What is it with you kids? Every other day it's food, food, food.
Instead of maybe only eating once a week or less, you are instead constantly looking for food to power your more calorie-dependent system. So really, it depends on the situation which is actually better. During the Permian, there was enough of both conditions to allow both endotherms and ectotherms to make a living. And in fact, it was actually slightly favorable toward the synapsid endotherms. But times have changed. And in the early Triassic, it suddenly became much harder to survive if you were an animal that had to eat every single day, because so much of the plant and animal life had been wiped out. You either became good at finding the hard-to-eat stuff like Lystrosaurus, or you were probably not going to be able to get what you needed. Lystro is one of the very few synapsid success stories from the first half of the Triassic. With no competition or large predators, their population exploded and at one point represented 75% of the vertebrate life on land. This is something that we have never seen from a single species before or since, and it would give their family, the Dicynodonts, the best foothold in the Triassic of any other stem mammals. On the other hand, for the Therapsids, times were getting really tough. The huge dominant Gorgonopsids were completely gone, and only a few types of Theracephalian and Cynodonts were left. The former had hung on in a species known as Moscarinus, a dog-sized hunter who is one of the species that show possible evidence of having venom glands. But unfortunately, this would not be enough to save them. In the end, they would disappear around 1 million years after the start of the Triassic. We Cynodonts would fare a little better than that, but it was starting to look bleak for the once proud stem mammals.
Steve, I don't feel so good.
We have to pull through this, Tim Tim.
No, I think this is it for us. We're done for. I'm fading, I can feel it. And we don't have a microwave to cook our factor meals.
Damn it, Tim Tim, we can't go out like this. In this time of weirdness... Oh, okay. I guess we're not going to change very much. Luckily, along the coasts in those forests mentioned earlier, there was just enough food available to allow some of the small Therapsids to hang on. But unfortunately, our glory days were over. For now, we were going to have to survive in burrows, hiding from the larger animals, able to become more dominant in this sun-baked world. In forms like this, the squirrel-sized Theraxodon, or the even smaller Microgomphodon.
I don't want to be Microgomphodon. The name even makes me sound puny.
You are puny, but that's how we're going to survive. And if you take a look outside, you'll see why. As the Triassic continued, eventually new large animals were going to start to emerge. But the global climate was now favoring the ectothermic diapsids, decades. So this was truly the start of the age of reptiles. One group that started getting larger and spreading into different niches was the Alacodosaurs. This group of lizard-like animals seemed to have started out in the coastal forests, but eventually started to spread into the dry interior. They became several different species, the most well-known member being this interesting-looking fellow, Shringosaurus, who had 2 forward-facing horns on top of its head. These horns are thought to have been used as a defensive weapon, both against predators as well as rivals, with the horn and skull structure bearing many similarities to the horned ceratopsian dinosaurs that would evolve much later, despite being in no way closely related to them. But unlike in those dinosaurs, these horns seem to be a sexually dimorphic feature, meaning only one gender had them, probably the males, but we really don't know for sure. But what we do know is that there was definite evolutionary pressure to grow defenses like this. For one thing, the evolution of new top terrestrial predators for the first time in almost 5 million years. These first killers were from the branch of reptiles called the archosaurs, and this would be the blueprint of things to come. This massive-headed monster is known as Erythroseuchus, the first archosaur apex predator. But when your choices of prey are a faster-running herbivore sporting defensive horns on its head, or what is basically a hot dog with feet, well, you could probably guess what was going to be on the menu most of the time. Listro had gone so long without any major competition or predators that when something finally did come along to fill those roles, they were no longer prepared to deal with them. Ironically, as the world slowly recovered from the Great Dying, the ones who pulled through and thrived in the post-apocalyptic world were not able to survive when the competition started to pick up again. But this would not be the end for the Dicynodonts as a whole. Because Lystrosaurus had spread so far and wide in the first few million years of the Triassic, different surviving branches would live on and become entirely new species wherever they could get by. But wherever they were now living under a new dynasty, because now it was the Archosaurs' world. By around 235 million years ago, some of the plants that had held on along the waterways for the past 20 million years had become better adapted to this hot, dry world. The deep interior of the continent was still largely desert, but conifers, cycads, and ferns were beginning to spread inland, making more woodland environments available for herbivores to survive. And these dry conifer forests would be the setting of the next great explosion in animal diversity. Of course, in this hot world, water was key, so the greatest concentration of animals made their home in and around the rivers and swamps. And with these fresh waterways being such a rare and precious commodity to all life on Pangea, it was a given that sooner or later, something was going to come along to take advantage. For the first time, we would see animals adopt a very specific hunting strategy that relied on this one simple fact. Everything needs water. But now, it was no longer always safe to drink the water, because now, several different predators lurked just below the surface. The first to appear was a member of the amphibian Temnospondylus, a group that really pioneered this hunting strategy for vertebrates. But now, it had been taken to an extreme, and they have become the most powerful Temnospondyle ever, the 6-meter or 20-foot long Mastodonsaurus, the king of the rivers in the first several million years that these forests spread across the land. And also, on a more modest note, another amphibian first appears at this time, one that is much more recognizable to us today, Triatobatrachus, the first true frog. Despite doing well for the first several million years of the Triassic, and in fact using these waterways as the way that they survived the Permian extinction to begin with, the rivers would not be ruled by the amphibians forever, especially as new herbivores like the Alacodosaurs and Dicynodonts evolved into new species and were starting to get larger and more common. With the growing abundance of prey items, oceans, new predators were going to show up on the scene as well. And whether it was on land or in the water, the reptiles were here to take over. And even the mighty Mastodonsaurus was going to feel the pressure. There were two groups that started to go in this very crocodile-like body plan. Ironically, neither one of them are true crocodiles. The Proterochampsians and the Phytosaurs. Now, they definitely look very crocodile-like, and they are also part of the same Archosaur family tree that crocodiles would eventually come from. But the actual closest relatives of true crocodiles were doing something very different at this time in Earth's history. Perhaps it was because of these other groups filling the ecological niches that would eventually be taken over by them. After all, this now makes 3 groups of large ambush apex predators waiting at the water's edge, and possibly making this some of the scariest rivers the world had ever seen. On land, despite the presence of all these other types of animals, the Archosaurs were solidifying their dominance of the world in a way not seen since the rise of the synapsids in the Permian. They were filling every possible ecological niche. Herbivores like the armored Atosaurians and the bizarre beaked Rhynchosaurs joined the ranks of the Alacodosaurs and Dicynodonts and started to branch out into all different sorts of specializations. And a few other Archosaurs would actually start to develop a more fleet-footed build designed for speed and maneuverability. And even a metabolism that, although wasn't quite endothermic, was notably higher than the standard ectotherms. These animals would be part of the clade known as Ava metatarsilia, with creatures like Dromaeosaurus, Silesaurus, Marasuchus, and this guy, Sceleromoculus, which has been described as almost like a reptilian spring hare or kangaroo rat. And these are super interesting animals for sure, as we definitely don't have anything like them today. But they were not on top of the food chain in the early Triassic. That honor was held solely by the descendants of animals like Erythrosuchus, the Pseudosuchians. The time of the land crocs was only just beginning, with the 13-foot, 500-pound Rauasuchus sitting on the very top of the food chain, and very little who could hope to challenge it. For the Ava metatarsilia, this speed and agility was probably made a viable strategy by the fact that they had very little hope of overpowering the Pseudosuchian masters of this hot, dry world. And as long as the world remained like this, there was very little hope of that changing. But honestly, if we stop and take a look back for a minute, it was impressive that life was able to bounce back at all. In the past 30 million years, life had managed to claw its way back from the very edge of oblivion, and did so when the planet itself was not exactly the most hospitable for harboring life. Only now do we see things start to get back to the point where animals can start to specialize again. This could ultimately only happen with animals that could adapt to this world racked by constant drought-like conditions. So, the ectothermic reptiles were, in this case, the best evolved for the task. And as the world continues to heat up and get drier, that will continue to be the case. But the one thing that we should all keep in mind at this point is that nothing ever stays the same.
Did I just hear thunder?
I want to thank everyone who has watched this video through to the end. If you follow me here or on any other social media platforms, you've probably seen that this year as a whole has been pretty challenging for me in several different ways. And on top of that, it took me a really long time to get the script to a point that I really liked how it turned out. I have literally written the script for the early Triassic video 7 times because I keep not feeling good about the way that it's turning out. Maybe this is just me being a perfectionist, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to release a video, especially in this series, until I really feel good about how it's going to turn out. I hope that makes sense to everyone. The history of the Earth is kind of my magnum opus, and I will not accept putting something out that feels half-baked. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and have a good one, everybody.